45 minutes to the presentation. I'm happy to take questions as they go along. I'm also happy at the end, depending on where we are sitting with respect to our timing, to take some questions at the end as well. Before I start, I want to set just some guiding principles for the discussions for today. I do this routinely in this kind of presentation because climate change is one of those things that we, I speak as an engineer, as technical people, we love to debate this, and it's highly entertaining, and it's the kind of thing that I'd love to do. But for the purpose of this presentation, I am stating as guiding principle that the climate's changing. I don't state any reason as to why the climate is changing, so I'm not attributing that to greenhouse gas emissions or not to greenhouse gas emissions or to water vapor or to any of the other things that people like to talk about when we get into that question, but just a simple acknowledgement that it is changing, and that climate change threatens the ability of engineers and infrastructure owners and operators to safely and effectively design and operate infrastructure that meets the needs of Canadians. It calls into question our current rules and design standards, and we will have to, in some areas, change the way we design and operate and maintain infrastructure as well. Now, we've done a bunch of case studies using the tool I'm going to describe today, and I think we've completed 8, and we are currently in the process of doing about another half dozen. So we can talk a bit about the implications of this towards the end of the presentation. The tool that I'm about to describe is one tool to aid owners, operators, practitioners in assessing this kind of risk. There are others. We're very familiar with this tool, and we're very comfortable with its ability to suss out issues with respect to climate change and infrastructure. So that's what we'll be talking about. Once again, just another guiding principle, we define public infrastructure as those facilities, networks, and assets operated for the collective public benefit, including health, safety, cultural, or economic well-being of Canadians, whether they're operated by government and or non-government agencies. So public infrastructure, by our definition, could be privately owned infrastructure that's operated for the benefit of the public. And in a lot of jurisdictions, for example, that could be electricity infrastructure, which is privately owned but operated for the public benefit. So we need to think a bit about what we mean by engineering vulnerability, especially engineering vulnerability with respect to climate change. In my previous webinar, I described this in some detail, and if you would like to take a look and get a bit of an understanding of that, I direct you to the taping of that that the Safe Drinking Water Association has on the website. So we have gone through that, and I will not be dwelling on that too much today, but it's important to understand that it's engineering vulnerability we're talking about, and by definition, that's a shortfall in the ability of public infrastructure to absorb the negative effects and benefit from the positive effects of changes in the climate conditions used to design and operate infrastructure. It's a function of the character, magnitude of the rate of change of those changes, how sensitive that infrastructure is to the change in terms of whether they're positive or negative outcomes from the change. They can be positive sometimes. It's also a function of the built-in capacity of the infrastructure to absorb any net negative consequences from the predicted changes. So climate change, it hits a piece of infrastructure, it can have a negative or a positive effect, and how much resiliency have we designed into that piece of infrastructure to accommodate what we're projecting it's going to see. So how can we assess vulnerability and resiliency of infrastructure? And I've made reference to this already once this morning. Engineers Canada, in partnership with Natural Resources Canada, has developed a protocol, which is a set of procedures, that leads practitioners through a formal, documented process to identify vulnerabilities and resiliency. The important thing about the protocol, there are two things. One is it's a logical and systematic approach, and secondly, it demands documentation of the thought processes of the data that's been used, where there are data gaps, how they've been filled. So the documentation process that falls out of the protocol is as important as the logic of the thing. Because oftentimes we'll make decisions based on data, then we lose sight of what that data was, and we're asked later on, why did we make that decision? And it's hard to create a paper trail back to what started all of this. So the protocol actually creates a documentation process for capturing all that reasoning. And it applies standard risk assessment processes to this new concern. That is, we're using processes that are very familiar within engineering and operational management in terms of standard risk assessment, and we apply those questions to climate change impacts on infrastructure. And so we ask this. Once we get our head around that in terms of applying the process, it's pretty straightforward to those of us who've done a lot of risk assessment, or operational managers who've done a lot of ranking of risk or ranking of problems in the past. So we use similar processes, and they're very familiar. The unique thing about what Engineers Canada, Natural Resources Canada did was taking some very traditional, very familiar processes and actually focusing them on this particular issue. That was the unique development. So we need to quantify risk, and risk assessment tools and techniques can help us quantify that. The protocol I'm discussing is one such tool, but I always come back to what do we mean by risk. And I think this is an important point to just pause a little bit and cover some of the material we discussed last time around, because this is an area where I find we have the most amount of feedback and questions when we're dealing with this within our case studies. So we define risk in a very classical engineer operational management perspective. We define it as the product of the probability of an event and the severity of that event should it occur. So the probability and severity are considered to be mutually exclusive, so you work the probability independently of the severity, and then you merge the two together to get a sense of the overall risk. We, within the protocol, develop risk weightings and severity weightings that are unitless, so we end up with a unitless indicator that gives us a sense of what the risk is, and within the protocol we define that. And in the next couple of slides I'll show you how that would pan out in a notional risk assessment, and then I'll take you forward into what the actual risk assessment tool, the protocol, actually says. In defining risk, since it's a combined effect of probability and severity, we need absolutely to consider both, because very low likelihood and high severity can still be a very serious risk, or a very high likelihood event which is low severity can be a very low risk. So we need to understand both elements of that very well. Most of us have a pretty good intuitive understanding of risk, but we need guidance to sort out and assess the relative significance of likelihood and severity. And the example I like to give is the common cold, where it's highly likely that at some point over the next 6 or 8 months we will have a common cold. It's not going to be particularly serious overall, and so the overall risk associated with that common cold is pretty low, even though the likelihood's pretty high. However, at the same time, if we looked at the H1N1 risk, H1N1 has a much lower likelihood than having a common cold, but the severity, based on all the advice we were receiving, is that it'd be much higher. So even though the likelihood is smaller, the severity is also higher, and that would tend to rank it as a higher risk. We intuitively understand this, but we tend in our thinking and our day-to-day reasoning just blend the two and work it together. And in a risk assessment, we tend to tease it out and look at these things independently so that we get a really good understanding of what likelihood and what severity mean in each particular case. And the protocol guides practitioners through that process of assessing both probability and severity in a particularly rigorous manner and documented so that we can all see what the reasoning was. So if we, as a group, as a group, if we wanted to disagree, for example, if we wanted to disagree on, say, likelihood, we can debate that and say, well, you guys gave it a 3 and we think it's more like a 6, and you can have that kind of debate. And so the documentation process allows the dialogue to carry on, and that's a very important outfall of the work that occurs in protocol work, is creating a rational basis for discussing the issues. And so it's very useful in that way. Okay. What I'm going to show you before I get right into the description of the protocol is how the protocol would actually treat a climate change event. What we have in front of us is a standard risk matrix. It's colored, you'll notice color-coded, and the red boxes represent high risk as defined by the protocol. Yellow represents medium risk, and white represents low risk as defined by the protocol. The protocol actually allows practitioners and infrastructure owners some latitude in defining what's high, medium, and low risk based on these calculations. But this is a standard risk matrix. It's on a 7-point scale as according to the protocol as well. So we have a 0 to 7 scale for severity and a 0 to 7 ranking scale for probability. And once again, the protocol will guide us through and how to do some of that ranking. So what we have is a case here where we've done an assessment pre-climate change of a flooding condition. It is very serious flooding condition, but it happens very infrequently. So through a standard risk assessment process, we've defined that to be a relatively low risk. It's severe, but it doesn't happen all that often, and it could happen so infrequently that we would say we never see it in essence. However, with the changing climate, the frequency of that event actually may be going up, and this is one of the things that we would tease out through the protocol application and through looking at climate data and a number of ways of looking at this. And we'd say, well, based on our collective judgment as a team, we believe that that flooding event is going to actually occur much more frequently. The severity hasn't changed, but the frequency has, and that has shifted this particular climate event from low risk to a high-risk zone of the matrix. So we need to do something, and what we do is we undertake an adaptation initiative, and it could be any range of things. It could be management actions, changing the way you manage things. It could be design changes. It could be policy changes, or any sorts of thing. But in the process of doing that, it reduces the frequency of, it reduces the severity of that event. It takes it once again into a low risk zone. And this is basically the thought processes that we're undertaking when we do this work. What we're talking about today is this piece. Engineering vulnerability assessment helps you sort out what the change in risk is likely to be. The next piece, which is a management action, is risk mitigation, and this is what you're going to do about it once you know you got the problem. And so the protocol gives some advice, allows some latitude for giving advice, but not a lot, because the primary focus of the protocol is to suss out the risk. How we respond to that becomes a management decision, an engineering decision, and that's worked out within the infrastructure owner, with their teams, with their consultants, to sort that out on a go-forward basis. So there are the two of them together. They do interact basically once you understand what the risk is, and that's how we move forward. Okay, that's what we're trying to do. Now I'm going to go through a number of slides, and I'm going to show you how we go about applying a protocol to do this. You can describe the protocol, and as I said, this protocol is being applied in 8 completed case studies, and there's 6 more that are currently underway, and probably another half a dozen beyond that are in planning stages but not yet started. So we expect to finish the second cycle of studies within the next 18 months, and we'll, with all of that work, we will be informing how this protocol works, and what we understand as an engineering profession and as infrastructure owners and operators, what this means in terms of the risk that climate change may be presenting to us. So, PIEVC Engineer Protocol is what we call it. PIEVC is an organization that's basically a partnership between Engineers Canada and Natural Resources Canada. It's an acronym. It stands for Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee. We affectionately call it PIEVC, and we don't really need to dwell on it. It's just the name now, so we use it routinely as the name. It's PIEVC. It's the guys who do the work. We've developed a 5-step process, and as I said previously, it's a tool that's derived from standard risk management methodologies, focusing in on climate change. One of the biggest pieces of this thing is that we assess our data quality and data gaps all the way through the process. So we're always asking the question, is this data good enough to pass a reasonable judgment? And if not, are there things we can do to fix that data, to make it more useful? Sometimes the answer is, yeah, the data exists in the databases, we just have to query those databases slightly differently than we would normally do, differently, so that's a change. Sometimes the answer is, we really need to have this kind of data, and no one's been gathering it, so we go back to Environment Canada and to the climate guys and say, you know, we as technical professions need to have this kind of information, and we don't have it. And so that may be a finding that comes out of all of this as well. We apply it to vulnerability assessment of infrastructures, completed studies across Canada, and we have found, at this stage, that it's been a very useful tool for in the hands of qualified professionals throughout all of the studies. And I emphasize the word qualified here. This takes some expertise, and what we're finding is the best way to do this is with a multidisciplinary team, and that they're having at the table a range of expertise that we can draw on as we're assessing these things, because engineers don't understand climate data, and climate guys don't understand the engineering data, and we all draw different inferences from the data that's presented to us. And when we put ourselves in a team, close the doors, and hash it out together, it's amazing the kinds of new ways of looking at things that falls out of this. And that's basically what one of the strengths of the tool. So it has to be multidisciplinary, and you need the expertise at the table. More on that in a few minutes. When resources are limited, and I focus in on this, not every application of this protocol has an ideal set of resources. I actually stress, most of the time we don't have all the data we think we need. The computer models may have some issues. Quite frequently, we have access to regional climate models. The regional climate models are on a 50 kilometer by 50 kilometer grid, and we are looking at some location within that grid that is on a 1 by 1 kilometer, or maybe a building. And so we find that sometimes it's difficult for the computer models to actually get down to that level of granularity that we as technical people may be looking for. So that's a problem. Sometimes we don't all have the technical expertise we believe we need. And sometimes you can't afford to hire the people to do that. So the protocol gives some latitude for that as well. What we are saying, and have been saying all along, is that this need not deter infrastructure owners from completing an assessment, because how far you go in this assessment is really dependent on how much resource you want to depend, what you have to give to it. So you can do a high-level assessment and get some very good results, or you can do a very penetrated, very focused assessment, very detailed assessment, and get some good information as well. And oftentimes, in setting up a case study, it's really the discussion of where between this really detailed assessment and this very high-level assessment do we want to draw the line? And that line is usually drawn based on resource availability, funding, and the like. So that's okay. It still works. What the protocol does is identifies which questions we need to ask, but it doesn't dictate the methodologies that we use or should use to answer those questions. So it sets a series of questions, and then it leaves us as professionals and operators and owners to answer those questions using the tools that we understand the best. So we don't create a new way for everybody to have to think about this. What we found is that the previous slide says, well, you know, if resources are limited, our experience in all of our case studies to date, every single one of them is that resources are always limited. Always, always, always. There are usually gaps. Models may not cover the region being assessed, or as I said, they may not have the granularity we're looking for. Meteorological data may not have been collected, or quite frequently was collected and is lost. Operational records may not exist, or as quite more often the case, where it was collected contains in logs, and those logs going back 20, 30 years are now missing because people have moved and files have been filed away and the like. And also we have staff turnover, so there could be an experience gap. We understand that there was a flood in this region in 1986, but the guys who dealt with it are no longer working for the organization, so we don't know exactly precisely what they did. And so that leads to a corporate memory lapse. And so these are all gaps that we have to confront and deal with. And over the series of case studies that we've done, we have always managed to figure out a way to suss out the data that we really need. Part of it is determining what the priority on that data is. Do you really need it, or do you just want it? And you know, there are other ways of answering that question, given the gap. And so part of it lends itself to the expertise of the team and the kinds of questions we get asked. So, as I said, it comes to the integrity of the team, the depth of the team. So we define this to be a multidisciplinary activity, and team structure is a crucial element of filling the gaps. That's how we do it. So for this to work, you have to have expertise in risk and vulnerability assessment. You need directly relevant engineering knowledge of that infrastructure. You need climatic and meteorological expertise relevant to the region. Oftentimes, these things are within the organization or already, and you're just missing, say, the climatic and meteorological expertise, but Environment Canada will provide much of that for free. So you just have to ask the question, they will provide the answer. You need operational experience. You need hands-on management knowledge of the infrastructure. You need to know precisely what happened last time around. What did the guys do? I'll give you a case of this. In one case study, we were looking at the impact of blizzards on the ability to get operators to a water treatment plant, and the impact that might have on the ability to supply clean drinking water at that facility in the case of a very severe blizzard. And we broke the group up into small groups, and at one group we had most of the management staff, and in the other group we had most of the operational staff. Management had concluded, based on the question, that there was a gap in their management procedures, and that they would have to do something to deal with, you know, ensuring appropriate staffing of the facility in a blizzard. That was the conclusion of their small group. However, at the operational table, the guys were there, and actually I was at that table and discussing it with them. And as a manager and as an engineer, I stated the same. Made the same statement that the management table had made, and what I was told in no uncertain terms is it's not a problem. And what they said to me is that they would get there, and I said, well, what do you mean you will get there? And they said, well, in the past when we've had these kinds of events, we always got there. And I said, well, then how did you get there? And the answer was, well, one time when we had a very serious blizzard, I took my snowmobile and went to work on my snowmobile. And I said, okay, so what happens if you don't have a snowmobile? And the answer was, if it's very serious, they send the snowplow and come and get us. And I said, okay, so the outcome of that was a very different recommendation than what had come out of the management table. The management table said we need to institute new procedures. The operational table was basically saying we need to document what we actually do. Different outcome completely. And that's why you need local knowledge, because those are the guys who are going to tell you. How did you deal with it? Local knowledge filtered through the expertise of an assessment team will often compensate for much of the data gap and provide a basis for professional judgment of the vulnerability infrastructure. So there's a lot of professional judgment in this. And local knowledge really informs that professional judgment. You really need to know, what do the people who have their hands on that infrastructure, what did they actually really do? So, done in about 10 or 15 minutes here. We're now going to talk about the protocol in some at a high level of detail. The protocol itself, the protocol document is roughly 90 pages long, and it goes into very detailed, very specific, step-by-step set of questions. So what I'm going to show you over the next 6 slides is nowhere near that level of detail. So the protocol is a step-by-step process to assess impacts of climate change and infrastructure. And its goal is ultimately to help infrastructure owners and operators to incorporate climate change adaptation into design, development, and decision making. What the protocol really does is the following. We work out what are the likely climate events we're going to see, climate change events we are going to see in the region of the infrastructure. So we're looking at regionally in the close region of the infrastructure, what could we see? Second question we ask is, what are the infrastructure components that we're worried about? So it's a roadway, it's a bridge, it's culverts over 3 meters in size, culverts less than 3 meters in size, and the protocol will take the team through a process of setting up what that infrastructure component list would be. And oftentimes it would be done as larger components and subcomponents. So it may be laid out as a bridge and then the relevant subcomponents of the bridge structure that we'd be looking at. Or it may be laid out as a water treatment facility within water treatment clarifier operation, within clarifier operation subcomponents of the clarifier. So it'll take you to that. What we really want to get to is where there's an interaction between the climate and the infrastructure. So where does that climate change actually have some effect, or could have some effect, on the infrastructure? And that's the question we ultimately ask. So if the climate's changing, but it doesn't touch the infrastructure, then there's not an adaptation issue. But the climate's changing and it does touch that infrastructure, could have an adaptation issue, and that's where we do the risk assessment. So here's the 5-step process at the highest level. First step, project definition. We define, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, we basically define geographically in space and in time. So what is the time frame we're looking at? Is it the next 3 years, the next 40 years, the next 100 years? So we define what's the infrastructure, where is it located, and what time frame are we looking at. How much historical data do we need? How far back do we go? How far forward are we forecasting events? So it's take us through that process. Second step would then be, based on the project definition, let's start going out to find the data. And this is where we might engage climatologists to do some modeling for us, or we might go to the Environment Canada websites and draw data down, or we might be talking to Environment Canada about this. We'll take a look at what evidence do we have of problems in the past, what severe events have affected this infrastructure and how, and that might give us a sense of where we're vulnerable going forward because we've had issues previously. What operational logs can we find? What people can we talk to? So we start going through the process of amassing basically a data room for the project. And one of the questions that falls out of this is, do we have sufficient data to answer some of the questions? And if not, how do we go about getting that data? The next step, which is actually the largest step of the process, is an actual risk assessment. I'll describe that in a bit more detail later, but it is based on the data that we have on hand. So basically we would convene a team, do a workshop. Everybody would have access to the data. We would know what the climatologists are saying, what the operational logs are saying. Everybody would know what that all is, and then we'd sit down as a team with professionals, operators, everybody else, and ask the question, what does this mean in terms of risk to this infrastructure? At that point, we reach a decision. The protocol outlines a more detailed engineering analysis. It's a technical analysis using indicators of vulnerability. And you can do this, but we urge people to do this as on a selected few very important parameters, because it is a very resource-intensive activity. You need to have some very specific data on the design load of that infrastructure, its current capacity, what the forecast load changes are based on change of use and weathering, normal weathering, not climate change weathering. And then beyond that, we need to understand what is the impact of climate change on that load. And so it gets very detailed and can become quite resource intensive. There's some really important times when you may want to do this. But what you don't want to do is do it for every single parameter that you've decided to look at, because you could be paying consultants many dollars to go through this analysis, and to yield results which you basically understood right out of the risk assessment. So there's a decision point based on the risk analysis whether you do this. And the protocol says, yeah, you can step right beyond this for many of this or all of the components and simply go to conclusions or recommendations. Or you could select some items for further, more detailed engineering analysis. This is also a resource that, like I said, could be a resource thing. You may have already decided you're going to do this and resource the project to handle it, and so you're ready to go. You do that work, and at that point you have another decision point, and it could be based on my better understanding of this particular climate infrastructure interaction. I believe that our original risk assessment was incorrect, and we want to do that little piece of it. Or you could say, based on the understanding we have, we're comfortable to make recommendations regarding that piece of infrastructure. And so there's some potential loops in there. So defining your baseline, this is project definition. Here's the kind of stuff that we would do, and this is in a little bit more detail than I just described, but here's what you're going to be looking at. You'll need specific details of the infrastructure. Where is it? So what kind of infrastructure are we talking about? How is it being designed? How long has it been in operation? And the like. You'll need an understanding of the site setting. So we need to know where it is, and it's important at this point to understand where it is not only on a map, but where it is geologically. Is it in a valley surrounded by mountains, or is it on a prairie? Is it sitting right beside a huge lake somewhere? Because those kinds of things that, with respect to site setting, can have an effect on microclimates, which affect the results that we would report. So oftentimes you would say, for example, in some locations we may have looked at, it's on the prairies, but it's in a valley of a river in the prairies, and that can have some effect on the way we look at the climate. And then we need to gather climate data, and we input that into the team as part of the project definition. And what we're asking is, given the data that we've got, is there sufficiency to move forward? In this case, we're not talking just about the quantity of data. Do we have climate data? Not just that kind of question. Or do we have infrastructure data? The other question we would be asking is, do we trust the data that we've got? So data sufficiency refers both to data gaps and data quality. And as a team, we would assess that, and we'd say, for example, we've got some climate data, but the error bands on that data are very, very, very large. And so we want to treat that data with some caution. And then we ask the question, are we happy to move forward given that quality of the data, or do we need to do something to tighten up our confidence? So that's a step that we would take here, is sufficiency of data. It's a question we ask. If the answer is no, then we go back and start digging it out. And then if the answer is yes, we move forward into step 2, which is gathering data again. So once again, step 2 is very similar to step 1, but it's just much more detailed. Now we're starting to penetrate in and get more detail. We actually do an inventory of the infrastructure at the level we've decided we need to go. And oftentimes what we tend to do is over-inventory the infrastructure and then knock things off the list. So when you get in a room with people who operate infrastructure and ask them to do this inventory, they will give you lists that go on and on and on and on. And that's good. That's good. And then we as a team edit it down to what are the relevant few. We look at climate change impacts in the area. That could be, like I said, for models could be. We also look at other change effects. So other change, like I said, could refer to population demands are increasing on the infrastructure, or normal weathering is underway. Or another change effect is within the time frame of this particular piece of infrastructure, we contemplate doing some refurbishment, and that would have an effect on the loads and things that we're looking at. And then we look at other infrastructure characteristics. How does it normally respond to loads being placed on it? So if we have evidence of flooding in the region, how did that infrastructure respond to that flooding in the past? Well, when I talk about those kinds of infrastructure characteristics, we're pretty broad in that definition. So not only how did that infrastructure respond, but how did the people who operated that infrastructure respond, and did that mitigate the problem, or were there still outstanding issues and the like? So we ask those questions, and we start to gather the data and try to fill the gaps. From all of this, we select relevant variables for future analysis. So a lot of this stuff that we've done on the left hand maybe just give us not too much relevant data, and so we knock it out. Like I said, we edit it. We ask the question, is the data sufficient? Yes or no. If it is, we move on. If no, we go back and repeat and repeat and repeat until we are confident with the data. Then we do the risk assessment, which is a judgment-based process with a multidisciplinary team. We judge significance of an interaction that I described earlier. We judge its likelihood. We judge the response of the infrastructure to that interaction in the future. And we have some judgment on our uncertainty, because that has some bearing, can have some bearing on the risk profiles that we assign. We as a team sit down and undertake a very detailed step-by-step risk analysis where we look at the probabilities and severities of all of these things as a team, coming to consensus on what those risk scores and severity scores are. And then we calculate risk numbers, as I showed in the first chart, that tell us whether it's a high, medium, or low risk as defined by the infrastructure owner. So what is our risk tolerance here as an infrastructure owner, and is it high, medium, or a low risk? Then we have to decide what we're going to do. Is engineering analysis required? That's the step 4 of the protocol. Is it possible to make conclusions and recommendations? The answer is yes. That goes to step 5 of the protocol, which is basically, just as I said, conclusions and recommendations. Or C, I don't know and I need to go back and get more data. Now that could be, I don't know and I need to get more data, could be either an iteration within the process, or it could be a recommendation from the process, depending on what kind of data you need. And it may be, we need detailed data on hail in this region that's never been collected. And at that point, going back to step 1 and 2 may not be particularly relevant. It may be relevant to make a recommendation that we need to initiate a process to gather that kind of data in some way. So just as an example, I stress, and I'm going to go into step 4 very quickly. Step 4 is almost optional, and here's why. What we would do with step 4 is we would tend not to look at the high-risk outcomes in step 4. We would actually tend to focus more in on the medium-risk outcomes because in that area there's typically a little bit more fuzziness. We don't, you're medium because maybe there's a bit more uncertainty in your numbers, and that's why you downrated the risk a little bit, or the severity a little bit. Not sure. You want to have a closer look at that. If an outcome is a high risk from your risk assessment, generally we as practitioners know exactly what we're going to recommend, and we don't need to do this kind of detailed analysis. We go right to, it's a high risk and we know what we need to do. If you do step 4, what you need is data on existing load, projected climate change loads, projected loads from other changes. You need to understand the existing capacity. You need to project capacity change versus age and use, and then any projected additional capacity from refurbishments and the like. And you pop that into your engineering analysis and you start calculating. And it will, at this point, you will calculate the number of indicators. You will every time have data sufficiency questions out of this, and so you may end up doing some iterations trying to tighten up your data so that the engineers in the group, myself included, are happy that the calculation is telling us something meaningful. So this is a step that can be done, and I actually, in preference in working case studies, prefer to do this on 1 or 2 or 3 really important, critical parameters. And then, yeah, we go ahead and do this. If the data isn't sufficient, you actually go back and regather. If the data is sufficient, you may actually want to do some more risk assessment. So that's what we said, it could iterate back, or it could, if you decide you don't need to do that, that you're now comfortable with the risk ranking or the vulnerability or resiliency of this infrastructure, you can step into the last step of the protocol, and I'm 2 minutes off schedule here, so I'm right there. So last step, protocol, it does provide some guidance on recommendations. It doesn't tell you what to recommend, but it does tell you what kind of recommendations you may wish to consider. So it could say, we need to take remedial action on this based on a high-risk profile, and we need to undertake steps to do remedial action. It may not define that remedial action. It may simply say you need to do it, and the engineers have to go down and sit down and figure out how to do it. Or it may say, depending on the depth of the team and the issue at hand, they could actually identify what that remedial action outcome is. And this is one of the reasons why we like the interdisciplinary teams, because oftentimes we find that once the risk is exposed, the answers start coming out on the table right away. We as technical people tend to like to answer those questions as we ask them, so we tend to work the issue a bit. And so the protocol allows you to gather up that preliminary stuff and report back on it to the infrastructure owner. Similarly, for management actions, it might not be a technical thing you need to do. It could simply be we need to adjust the way we manage this particular aspect of the operation. Maybe we need to change. We need to change the resources we maintain on site. We may have to have sandbags on site. We don't, so we need to have that available to us, and that kind of thing. It could, and I would say more often than not, based on the Canadian infrastructure that we've looked at, no further action needed, more often than not. It's robust. What we have found on every study is 1 or 2 elements of the infrastructure where there is a vulnerability. So overall, the infrastructure that we've looked at has been pretty robust, with 1 or 2 weak links that need to have something looked at. So that's what our findings is at to date. So we have not done a study where, it's in a critical mess and everybody's in trouble. What we have found is that generally things are pretty well managed, things are pretty well designed, and we are anticipating a change in some of our design and management assumptions, and that's going to change the way maybe we schedule refurbishment on this particular piece of infrastructure. Instead of doing it every 10 years, we may do it every 7 or 5 years. You may top up the height of the wall and the like. And as a consultant, we always leave this one in. There's more work needed, and that's there. And oftentimes we have found that indeed the practitioners, the owners want to have some recommendations saying, well, what do we need to do next? And it might be another engineering study. It might be some interaction with environment camps. As a matter of fact, it's quite often a recommendation from Environment Canada themselves to put in recommendations around the data needs. Because what they have said to us from the climatology group in Environment Canada is they need to know what data we need to know, and if they know that they can adjust the way they do things for us and gather the data that we need to know. So they often recommend to us that we highlight that so that they can change things on their end. So that may not be an additional study that you as practitioners or infrastructure owners need to do, but it could be something that you could recommend to Environment Canada that they need to do to help you. So that is the PIEVC engineering vulnerability assessment protocol at the highest level. Like I said, it's a 90-page document, very detailed. It is presently a proprietary protocol, but it is proprietary at no cost to users. So basically, if you want to do a study, the use of the protocol is free of charge, but you need to enter into an information agreement with a memorandum agreement with Engineers Canada that says basically we agree to let you use the document. And one of the things we're asking for at this stage of its life is you share with us the results that you get from using that so that we can inform the process of revising and improving the protocol for future use. So if you use it and you have trouble with it, then identify where those trouble areas are, and we'll work with you to identify ways to fix it. Then we will also identify ways to reorganize the protocol on a go-forward basis. There's still currently co-funding available for some studies through Natural Resources Canada, and that's accessed through David Lapp at Engineers Canada. So this is why his contact points are here. You need or are interested in further information on how to get your hands on the protocol, or you want to do a study and maybe you're interested in co-funding. David Lapp of Engineers Canada is the guy to speak to. If you want to see what's happened in the past, I would advise you to check the PIEVC website, which is identified here, and it will tell you. You can pull down the older studies and see what people did. You can see how they applied the protocol. You can see the issues that they encountered, and you can also see the recommendations they made. So if we've done studies on water resources systems, we've done water treatment, we've done drainage, done studies on roads, we've done studies on buildings. So if you want to take a look at what other people saw on infrastructure that you operate, the data is available. You can take a look and see what they sussed out for their thing. So that's a recommendation there. And I am almost out of time here, but I do have about 6 minutes for any questions. So if there are any, I can take them now. And if they're not, then I'd be happy to let you go. So Nicole, I'm not hearing any questions. Do you want to make any closing remarks or anything? And maybe in doing so, people will come up with something, and then we can close. I'll also offer, if you have questions about any of this afterwards, to give us, feel free to just drop us a line, drop us an email, or talk to David Lapp, and we can fill in some of the gaps for you. So don't have burning question right now. That's okay. Over to you, Nicole.
Okay, so I'm going to give everybody about another minute in order to think of questions. So if there are no questions in about a minute, then we will conclude. Remember that first part of Joel's webinar is also available to view as a video. I'm going to post a link into the chat room that will have his Part 1 webinar video. Will also contain his Part 2 webinar video in a few days, and will also contain the other webinars that we have done through the Safe Drinking Water Foundation. So I'm going to post that link and give everybody about a minute to think of any questions that they might have. And we also have one exciting webinar coming up as well next Thursday. That will be about the downstream DVD. And it will be with Andrew Nikiforuk, Dr. John O'Connor, Leslie Iwerks, and also with George Portres. So look for that in your email, and I would say that's one definitely not to miss as well.
So just this, Joel, one last time. I'm not seeing any questions, so I think that I will call this to a close. I just wanted to say thank you very much for your time and attention today. I really appreciate that. I know that everybody's got a really busy schedule, so we really appreciate the time that you take to come and listen to us speak on this subject.
Thank you, everyone, for your time and for participating, and have a great day and a great weekend coming up. Oh, and of course, also a big thank you to you, Joel, for presenting for the second time. You're definitely becoming a pro at this.
Yeah, thanks very much.